strands of Christianity.
Hello, welcome back to Straightforward, Levant TV's Middle East political debate show. With me, Khaled Al-Khawairi. The carnage in Gaza is ongoing. Some are celebrating it, and calls for genocide have initiated. What did the world do, and what did the Arab world do, and who are the key regional and international players in preparation for the attack and throughout it? Swedish authorities refused to allow the plane of Israeli President Shimon Peres to cross into its airspace. And throughout the show, we will look at the humanitarian aspect of the crisis and then assess political dynamics and policy implications. Let me first welcome our guests here at the studio, Jim Brann of Stop the War Coalition and Sabah Jawad of Iraqi Democrats Against Occupation. Welcome on the show. Before we delve into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report by Saima Jafar and Hassan Samak.
As Israel intensified its operations in Gaza, hundreds of thousands of people around the world protested in support for the people of Gaza. Thousands took to the streets in London, New York, Paris, and even in Tel Aviv. London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Newcastle saw marches to protest at the BBC's biased reporting, as well as to gather signatures for an open letter to the BBC Director General. London took to the main stage of the protest movement.
I urge all sides.
United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has urged Israel and the Palestinians to stop fighting and made an urgent appeal for maximum restraint. Meanwhile, US President Barack Obama said although there is great concern for the increasing Palestinian civilian death toll, the US supported Israel's mission.
As I've said many times, Israel has a right to defend itself against rocket and tunnel attacks from Hamas.
US Secretary of State John Kerry, who is in Israel to conduct peace negotiations despite a Federal Aviation Administration ban on flying to the region, said slow progress was made on ceasefire talks. But will reactions and diplomacy help end what is happening on the ground?
Jim Brann, since 2008, Israel had not had any ground invasion in Gaza. Before we get into the global reactions to this, how could we look at the significance of the timing, and could we relate this to the recent event of forming a unity government with Hamas?
I think undoubtedly, if you take the issue of the kidnapping of the 3 settler youth, and then the killing of the Palestinian boy, for the Israeli government simply declared that the kidnapping was the work of Hamas. Even though on the face of it you would think, why on earth would Hamas specifically do that? It would be nonsense. So the intention of the Israeli government to finger Hamas, to blame Hamas for things, is very, very clear. And I don't think there is any doubt that it has to do with the unity of the different factions in Palestine as a whole.
Why do you call them settler youth, not Israeli citizens?
Well, the world recognizes a distinction. I mean, you have to be, cynical because there are protecting powers. Nevertheless, the world does not recognize them as being Israeli citizens in the same sense.
Sabah Jawad, do you agree?
Well, I think the distinction between Israeli citizens and settlers is very weak distinctions. Israeli society is based on settling in a land that does not belong to them, and therefore the settlers, and I think it's a fair description of them, occupy the lands of the Palestinians and promote discrimination against the Palestinians, and the Palestinians have the right to resist these people and to expel them from their land as long as they are basically tools and the occupiers' hand.
And Sabah Jawad, Hamas fired 4 rockets on Israel. These were met by 6 Israeli airstrikes. From a power perspective, what can you tell us about the disproportionate aspect throughout this?
It's always been the case of disproportions regarding the Palestinian struggle to return to their homeland and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The Israelis get all the aid and support from the most powerful nations on earth, the Western nations, topped by the United States. They get the most advanced military hardware, like Phantom F-16, tanks, and so on. And they got all the protection that's needed, actually. And the Palestinians have nothing. basically. They rely on some kind of rockets which they manufacture themselves, or they got given by Syria and some other regimes in the Middle East. So it's always disproportionate. And the Israelis always claim, actually, that their action is a response to these rocket attacks. But even if Palestinians don't fire rockets at Israel, the Israelis will find excuses to trying to suppress the will of the Palestinian people. They've been at it for 65 years, and they will continue so until they break the back of the Palestinian resistance.
Jim Brann, the Jerusalem Post, argues that no military operation could be more justified than Operation Protective Edge. What do you think of that?
Well, I think first of all, as in all of human life, you have to distinguish between reasons and excuses. And to summarize it as briefly as possible, this is an excuse. This is not a reason. This assault on Gaza. The excuse is some, the rocket, the so-called rockets, which somebody has called more like fireworks, coming from Gaza, the tunnels. These are the two big excuses, but they're not the reason. The reason is the injustice of the occupation, of the suppression of the national rights of the Palestinians. That's the fundamental issue. And you can always find some justification or some excuse in the same way as in ordinary life. Like you can pick up on what somebody is looking at you wrongly or spilt something on you and then use that as an excuse. It's just an excuse.
Sabah Jawad, speaking of the tunnels, from a security perspective, Jonathan Rosen questions what could have happened had Hamas used its tunnels into Israel before Operation Protective Edge.
Well, I mean, it seems the tunnel took Israel by surprise. At least what the Israelis are saying, the press and Israel are saying, is that the Netanyahu government stood by, not doing anything, or did not know, the development of this sinister tunnels in the occupied territories, and particularly in Gaza. But everybody knows that the Palestinians be relying on these tunnels actually to break the sanction, to break the blockade against Gaza. It's been in place since 2008.
Jim, here in the UK, we've seen protests starting in Glasgow in relation to what was considered nuanced media coverage. What do you think of the media starting here in the UK?
Oh, I mean, we had this very effective demonstration last Saturday, for example.
Tell us more about that.
Well, we say up to 100,000. I don't know how many it was, but it was a magnificent thing. It was seen in Palestine. There was a report on Channel 4 which said that it was received in Palestine with joyous disbelief. That was the effect in Palestine. It's very effective, very unified. Many organizations worked together. It was very effective, had a tremendous spirit. And I think the police said, well, we're giving them the whole street. I think they actually worked out.
So they cooperated, they worked hand in hand.
The police, I can't criticize the police with that. They gave us the full width of the street. Sometimes they say, well, you can have half the width of the street. They just said, have it. And I think it was probably in their interest. And the question of BBC bias, so I went to look online at the reports of the demonstration on Sunday, and there were some very good ones. There's a newspaper that's not particularly sympathetic. Their website's the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail online website had a headline, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians, which is a slogan that people were chanting on the demonstration.
So that was on the Daily Mail?
That was on the Daily Mail website on Sunday.
Eyebrow-raising, isn't it?
And they had a very good, very respectful picture of the full width of the demonstration. So I then went to look at the BBC's coverage on BBC Online, and I was disgusted. I'm used to things, and I was just disgusted because they had, I think, about 8 items relating to Palestine, and the main one to do with protest was riots in Paris.
Not in London even.
And there was no mention, and when you read to the end of the French article, you saw a reference to the London demonstration. And then they had links on the BBC website to, for example, the Times of India reporting on the London demonstration. But no BBC report on the London demonstrations. Quite extraordinary.
I just say that the BBC is well known for its bad coverages and biased coverages against the Palestinians and the Arab causes. They've done the same to Lebanon, resistance against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and the resistance against the Israelis in other part of the world, and their coverage of Syria as well. The BBC reflect the views of the government, of the British government, and the British government views about what's happening in the Middle East is very much tied up with the state of Israel and the support of the Israeli action, no matter what's happened. And we've just seen the statement by the new Foreign Secretary visiting Netanyahu. He blamed the Palestinians basically for starting this genocide which is taking place against them.
But meanwhile, let me interrupt. David Ward, Lib Dem MP, got suspended for not apologizing straight away or for even stating what he said about...
Absolutely. I mean, this is the case, and BBC is well known in Britain, at least among the activists in Britain, who support the Palestinians, support the Arab struggle for independence and for liberations. They call the BBC the second Israeli embassy in London, and this is truly the case, because they tried all their efforts to prevent the British public, who pays the license fee for the BBC, from hearing the truth about what's happening in Palestine. But despite that fact, hundreds of thousands of people took to the street, not only last Saturday, so almost on a daily basis there is a demonstration outside the Israeli embassy and pickets, and it's going to be one tomorrow and one Saturday, and there's going to be more demonstrations taking place in all major cities in the UK.
Let me just clarify, these are the views of our guests, of course, be it about the BBC or any other subjects, and we do respect them. And speaking of David Ward, what do you think of his suspension, basically, for what he said?
Well, it's interesting that the Deputy Prime Minister, the Prime Minister is Cameron, and Cameron and his party are very openly supportive of Israel. But the Deputy Prime Minister is from the Liberal Democrat Party, and for whatever reason, and I can think of different reasons, nevertheless, about a week ago, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, very pointedly said that the Israeli bombing was deliberately disproportionate. So there is this clear faction within the Liberal Democrat Party which is far more in tune with public opinion, and which the Deputy Prime Minister, in the conditions of a forthcoming general election, feels it is important for him to somehow express. And that's positive, I would say.
Sabah Jawad, very briefly, how important and how effective are these demonstrations? Tell us about it from the perspective of an organization like Iraqi Democrats Against Occupation.
I think it's very, very important. Actually, sometimes you don't see the fruit of your action immediately, but we know from the Iraqi experience, there's a massive demonstrations that took place in London. In fact, the biggest demonstration ever took place in London was in support of Iraq against military attack and against occupation. Over 2 million people participated in that demo. And the result of that demonstration was not immediately visible because the occupation of Iraq happened and the war against Iraq happened as well with the participation of the British government. But we saw the result of such campaign actually in regard to the Syrian crisis when Parliament was debating whether to intervene military in Syria, even Parliament voted against it.
True. And now we are joined by political activist Tamara Barakat. Welcome on Straightforward.
Thank you so much.
Tamara, what do you think of media coverage on Gaza starting from the UK, and please touch on the West as well, America?
As I said before, the media coverage, especially in the West, is totally biased, and it only gives the Israelis to tell their side of the story, and it makes it sound as if, not recently actually, but for a while, the civilized democratic Israel versus the savage terrorist Palestine. This has been the image that has been portrayed in the media for ages. And whatever contradicts this image is totally ignored by the media. As your guest mentioned, many protests took place around the world and in huge numbers to support the Palestinians. And yet, the mainstream media, not just in the UK, but in the US and other countries, Western countries, they ignore that on purpose.
Yes,
and
Tamara, what in your opinion could make a difference, given, as you argue, mainstream media has been biased, but what could make a difference here? Is it social media? Is it activism?
Social media. That is why, if you follow Twitter and Facebook, you could see people referring to social media to show what the other side of the story, to show the protest, people that are the social media image, that has been portrayed of the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. So that's now social media is gaining momentum.
Tamara, in its reaction, Saudi Arabia seemed to be supportive and condemned the attack on Gaza. Yet there are people who think the kingdom was connected somehow in orchestrating the attack. What do you think?
And they and behind closed doors, and that's the for ages. So they not just.
We'll come back to you a little bit. A little bit later, Tamara. We have a bad line. We will get back to you shortly.
Okay.
So, Jim Brann, what do you think of the Saudi role, if you believe there was a role in orchestrating the attack, be it indirectly or directly?
There is no doubt, and it was spoken about quite openly last year, that there was a developing axis between Israel and Saudi Arabia. These things are usually choreographed in such a way that it's not done by a formal agreement or something, but if you look at the stands of the different parties, you can see a coordination. And I think it's extremely likely that there was some kind of understanding there, yes.
Yes. I think it's correct to what's been said. The role of Saudi is quite visible in a couple of points, actually. One of them is that we've seen in the past few years in the so-called Arab Springs, coordinated efforts to destabilize the resistance bloc, if you like, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and against Iran. Somebody is trying very hard, and I think it's led by the Saudis and the Turkish government, with the backing of America, to destabilize the areas and create some kind of like a united front against Iran and the resistance movement in the Arab world. We've seen what's happened in Syria. We've seen the plots against Lebanon and demonization of Iran as well, as part of the campaign to put Israel in a very favorable light.
Why are they interested in demonizing Iran?
Well, they quite obviously, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Councils, the regimes there, which has nothing to do with democracy. They are our antiquated entities in the Arab world. Mm-hmm. They could not survive without giving services to the United States and Israel, and they've been doing that. Qatar, for example, was leading the campaign to destabilize many countries in the Middle East, like Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, and so on. And so they think that by playing a role in attacking the resistance in the Arab world and allying themselves with the Israelis and more with the Americans, they will be able to safeguard their interest in the future.
Sure. Back to Tamara. Tamara, in its reaction, Saudi Arabia seemed to be supportive and at the same time condemned the attack on Gaza. What do you think of the Saudi role in prior to the attack?
Saudi Arabia is an ally of the U.S., and this makes it forced to do what the U.S. tells it to do. So that is why you see on the outside they show compassion and they say we condemn the attack and we are looking for to implement ceasefire. But behind closed doors, they finance and they support the attack due to many reasons. First, Hamas is now Qatar's ally. And as you know, Qatar and Saudi Arabia are arch enemies. And not to mention Hamas' strong relations with Muslim Brotherhood, which is also an arch enemy of Saudi Arabia. So the thing is, it's pretty complicated, yet it's pretty simple at the same time. If you're an ally of the U.S., you have to adopt the U.S. doctrine in the region. You have to demonize, like your guest said, demonize Iran, to adopt sectarian speech, to make Iran the biggest danger we have to get rid of, and to make Israel the less danger or something we should.
Yes, Tamara, Sabah Jawad would like to add on that. Stay with us.
Well, I think the points about the Saudi role in all this is it might also be linked to the positions of the Saudi regime to Hamas. Hamas is well known as part of the international Muslim Brotherhood organizations, and they've been getting a lot of support from Al-Qatari and Doha governments. And the Saudis don't like that. Actually, they wanted to kind of like a competition, Saudi Arabia in competition with Qatar regarding their allies in the area. And I think it's, the Saudis first of all wanted to weaken the resistance movement in the Arab world, but in the same time they also want to weaken the advantages Qatar gained by establishing a strong link with the Muslim Brotherhood internationally. And we see the positions, for example, regarding that's manifested itself in positions regarding the Egyptian regime. Mm-hmm. After getting rid of Morsi government, the Saudi have the upper hand in relationship with the Egyptian regime as well.
Tamara, very briefly, do you agree?
I totally agree, and also to add more, it shows the contradiction of the Saudi logic, you can say, because they've been, Saudi politicians have been adopting a sectarian speech for ages. They have been targeting Hezbollah and Iran because they're Shia, yet they also target Hamas, which is a Sunni organization, if you want to call it like this. So the thing is, those who follow Saudi Arabia or believe what Saudi Arabia does or says, they have to do a reality check and just see the situation in Gaza. And it's a perfect example just to show that any sectarian speech has nothing to do with politics, no matter how much Saudi affiliated clerics try to portray it as Sunni versus Shia. Actually, it's political interest versus other political interests.
Tamara Barakat, London-based political activist, thank you very much for being on the show at very short notice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl.
In Israel, Knesset member Ayelet Shaked called for the killing of the mothers of Gaza children who were targeted by Israeli strikes. She argues they need to be killed for delivering the innocent children she called, quote, little snakes. The world described the killing of children as appalling. In Lebanon, all 8 prominent TV stations presented an unprecedented unified news bulletin in solidarity with the children, women, and foreign activists in Gaza. Before we talk about the humanitarian element in the conflict, let's have a look at this brief report on child victims and the psychological consequences that the attack survivors will have to bear.
Since Israel began its Operation Protective Edge on Gaza, currently more than 600 Palestinians have been killed. More than 500 of these are civilians, and according to UNICEF, a third are children. The UN says more children than Palestinian fighters have been killed in the offensive. UK newspaper Telegraph reported that the Al-Mizan Centre for Human Rights, a Gaza-based human rights organisation which works with the UN, has verified the deaths of 132 children between July 7th and July 21st. So far, no Israeli children have been killed in the conflict, but Israeli activists and researchers report that the conflict has traumatized children on both sides of the walls. Trauma counselors say the constant fear of airstrikes and rocket fire has led many children of Gaza to suffer deep depression and anxiety.
أنتم ومن وراءكم من دول القرار نحن شعب لم يعد يخيفه الدمار فالموت في حياتنا فصل من النهار.
Jim Brann, more than 130 children have been killed in Gaza and the numbers are rising. Could we explain targeting these children through looking into Zionist ideology that believes in addressing the source of what they consider the problem?
Absolutely. You cannot believe, in my opinion, you cannot take the Israeli explanation to be anything but an excuse. And then you look at the facts and you arrive at a conclusion based on those facts. If you persistently kill hundreds of people, we are now on course to have a repetition of 2009. In 2009, all the line about we take great care, you know, this is the endless repeated Israeli line, we take great care, we more than anybody else, we take great care. They managed to kill in 2009 one Gazan in 1,000. One Gazan in every 1,000 was killed in 2009. Which they considered to be great care, great restraint. In 4 weeks they did that in 2009. In 6 years of the Second World War, the German bombing managed to kill one Briton in every 1,000. In 6 years. So that gives you some idea when they talk about taking great care, etc. I think
Are we comparing here when you mention Germany in the Second World War?
There's a valid comparison. I mean, you have to be. It just gives you some idea of the scale. If they talk about you know the restraint that we exercise, then in that sense, it's worth pointing out that in 6 years of Second World War, the same proportion of the British population was killed as in Gaza. So therefore, I think that the killing of children effectively is part of the exercise. I refer anybody to the fact that 44 years ago, the Israeli Prime Minister came to London twice and said the Palestinians do not exist. That was a notorious expression of the time. And it looked like 44 years ago, you could say the Palestinians do not exist. 11 years ago, the head of the Israeli military said the Palestinians must come to know in their deepest consciousness that they are a defeated people. Which, apart from anything else, shows a change. If you do not exist, you cannot have a deepest consciousness. So actually the situation was moving in that sense against Israel. This idea that you must teach the Palestinians a lesson, which is what he said 11 years ago, I think that is the constant Zionist line. If we cannot eliminate the Palestinians, then at least we must teach them that they are a defeated people. And I think that's basically what you're saying.
Sabah, I saw you taking some notes there.
Yes, I mean, it's very obvious actually that the founding fathers of the State of Israel, they considered that actually after a while, after 10, 15 years, 20 years, the Palestinians will forget about Palestine, a new generation will come. And
they're not giving them the chance to forget. Really.
Yeah, well, precisely this is what they thought they could achieve in Palestine, for the Palestinians to forget the land of Palestine, because the new generations are born and you know, the old generation dies.
True.
But we've seen, in fact, on the contrary, the new generations in Palestine are more demanding than their fathers regard their rights to return back to Palestine, and at the same time, the Palestinians perceive the Palestinian children as a project for a future struggle, and therefore they want to attack it and undermine it. And there are also links, for example, between this action against the children and the action against olive trees in Palestine. And when the Israeli police and army attack Palestinian youth, they seem to hit them. I've been told by Palestinians actually involved in the intifada, previous intifadas in Palestine, that the Israeli police hit them in the groin, because that area represents kind of like continuity for the future. And new children will come about and carry the flag for the liberation of Palestine. So this is part and parcel of the ideology of denying the Palestinians their right to struggle in Palestine. And killing the children is one obvious way of doing it.
And Jim Brann, the UN says more children than Palestinian fighters are being killed in the offensive. Do you think there could be a way to evacuate, for example, women and children by the help of the West to bring them to a safe haven?
It's possible. I think you have to be very careful because, for example, since the Israeli fundamental desire is to eliminate the Palestinians as Palestinians, for example, Gaza has been under complete Israeli blockade since whatever it is, 2008. You have to be careful because if you let out a whole section of the Gazan population, I don't think Israel's going to let them back in. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you have to think these things through.
And speaking of women and children, Navi Pillay, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, said there seems to be, quote, a strong possibility that that international humanitarian law has been violated in Gaza. Do you agree? And if so, why are top figures still portraying the issue in shades of grey?
Absolutely, I agree, and I think that Navi Pillay's words are very diplomatically chosen, and I understand why. But
why?
I don't, because she occupies that special position where, apart from anything else, as an international civil servant, all international civil servants are in that position where they are under great pressure from the big powers and the big donors and so on. I think it's undoubted. You see, it was established by the Geneva Conventions of 1949. The imperative to distinguish between civilians and fighters. And just self-evidently on the face of it, see, the overwhelming majority of Israelis who've been killed are soldiers who were actually in Gaza. They were engaged in land operations. If you take away the Israeli soldiers that were killed, then the disproportion is enormous. And I simply suggest that the enormous disproportion is a deliberate policy. I don't think there's any other explanation.
Do you agree?
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, I think the United Nations Human Rights Commission voted yesterday to hold an investigation into human rights violations of the bombing in Gaza. The European countries, by the way, they abstained, and this is to the eternal shame of the European countries, who are supposed to be championing human rights, and not only in the Middle East, but across the world. They had to abstain from this investigations. But a lot of people in the Middle East, and I'm one of them, consider the United Nations and institutions belonging to the organizations becoming part and parcel of the U.S. State departments. We've seen a human rights organization in the world switching to become part of the U.S. policies, and there is no surprise. Actually, the United Nations will conduct an investigations, but will do nothing about the result of such an investigations, because Israel could get away with murders, and Israel could get away with murder precisely because America and Western powers are supporting it to the hilt.
And now we are joined by Muhammad Ali, Palestinian political activist. Welcome on Straightforward.
Hello to you and welcome to your guest.
Muhammad, who in your opinion decided to stop this war in Gaza, to start this war in Gaza, sorry?
So far no breakthrough in diplomatic effort. Hamas points views that no ceasefire without agreement to lift the blockade in Gaza. Also, the Israelis say they might withdraw from Gaza without agreement. Achieving nothing, just killing over 700 civilians and 4,000 wounded. The U.S. and Egypt has no influence on Hamas, so they try with Turkey and Qatar to organize ceasefire.
Yes.
I think there will be no ceasefire without meeting the Hamas conditions.
Yes, and what do you think of the targeting of hospitals in Gaza? And do you think Israel is aiming at imposing a blockade for long?
I think it's barbaric action by the Israeli target hospitals in Gaza. Israeli occupation cowardly targeting ambulances and hospitals, has targeted Shuhada al-Aqsa hospital and also has targeted Al-Wafa hospital. There is no evidence of whatsoever Israeli occupation claims that Hamas rocket launcher site and placed beside the hospital, and now targeted UNRWA school, and they killing more than 16 civilian children and women.
Yes.
But the Israeli have no mercy. If they can, they will impose it forever. But I appeal to the Egyptian government must open the Rafah crossing and allow release medical convoys to enter Gaza, and also allow the wounded people to be treated in Egypt.
Mohammed, we have seen support in the Arab world from the media. What about action by major players in the Arab world at the diplomatic level?
Sadly and unfortunately, the Arab government turning a blind eye on what's happening in Gaza. If some of the Arab government against Hamas, it means they are against over 2 million people of Gaza Strip, because Hamas is democratically elected government.
Yes. That was Muhammad Ali, joined us over the phone. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
With boots on the ground, Operation Protective Edge is the first, but not necessarily the last, phase of Israeli ground operations. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon have ordered the IDF to prepare for a major expansion of the ground operation. Before we get into talks about the key players in all this and possible avenues to conflict resolution, let's have a look at this brief military chronology by Sabah Jawad.
Over the past 2 weeks, around 140 militants have been killed in Gaza, amounting to around 20 to 25% of the total Palestinian death toll. According to military analyst Alex Fishman, about 3,000 tons of explosives have been dropped on Gaza in the first 15 days of the conflict, with more than 2,100 rockets being fired from Gaza, targeting cities in Israel that hadn't previously been targeted, including Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Israel's nuclear base Dimona. The initial cause in 2006-2012 and now in 2014 has been a new attempt by Hamas to change the strategic facts on the ground, increasingly relying on rockets and missiles rather than irregular warfare in the form of ground or naval attacks on Israel. Hamas's rocket fire has caused fear and panic among Israelis in south and central Israel, with sirens sounding many times a day warning people to seek shelter. A big achievement from Hamas's perspective has been the disruption of flights to and from Tel Aviv's airport, with airlines from the US, Europe and elsewhere suspending flights after a rocket hit a house near the airport. Last week saw Israel intensify its offensive as it moved its troops on the ground for a ground invasion. By Wednesday morning, Hamas had killed 29 IDF soldiers and said it had also abducted a soldier. But the question is, have the changes in tactics and technology achieved anything different to previous conflicts?
Sabah Jawad, Israel accepted Egyptian proposed ceasefire. Hamas rejected it. It fires rockets into Dimona and Haifa and even Tel Aviv. It's easy to say the war is disproportionate, but the people of Palestine say they are entangled in a war that they know they're not winning. What are your thoughts on Hamas's decision to carry on?
I think Hamas' decision to carry on and not to give up its weapons is part and parcel of the demand by the people of Palestine, not only in Gaza, but also in other occupied Palestinian lands, and the whole masses in the Middle East, actually, the people in the Middle East and the freedom-loving people across the world. Why should the Palestinians actually not struggle or lay down their arms when they are subjected to this kind of treatment for the past 65 years and the land's been taken away from them? Is their rights, their legitimate rights to struggle and to use all means possible actually to go back to their homeland. Israelis is very limited in what they could do actually. We've seen in the past 16 days their limitation exposed, as their limitation exposed in Lebanon in in the year 2000 and 2006, where the Palestinian resistance scored notable, the Lebanese resistance scored notable victories against them. And we see the same situation developing in Palestine. Hamas and other organizations, let's not forget, is Islamic Jihad is also involved, and other resistance movement in Palestine. They're all united, and they are showing a new type of confidence. They are, I believe, most of the rockets you've seen fired at, in Israel, at Israel now, is manufactured in Gaza, actually, by the Palestinians themselves. So they're acquiring new technologies, and this kind of things actually was inevitable to happen, because Israel for the past 65 years has superiority in the air. Their phantoms and so on could destroy a lot of oppositions to it. But now with the development and the advanced technology, especially in rocket making, could endanger Israeli cities and in Israeli airport. Now we've seen many American airlines are stopping their people flying to Ben Gurion airport as well. So, you know, Israel has a limitation what they can do in Gaza. And by the way, up until now, today is the 17th day of the war starting. They haven't even entered Gaza proper. They are on outskirts of Gaza. If they go to Gaza, deeper into Gaza, you'll see the Israeli casualty will multiply. And instead of the 30 or so Israeli soldiers, you probably see in their hundreds die. And Israel cannot afford for such a result to happen.
Jim Brann, French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius said France will act forcefully to demand an immediate ceasefire. Tell us more about your activism in the UK to push the Palestine agenda into Westminster.
Well, clearly, I mean, there's been demonstrations during the week, over the last couple of weeks, but clearly last Saturday was the focus, and that was the first clear national demonstration. There's another one this Saturday, and there's every reason to think that it will be that much more impressive than last Saturday. If you go back to 2009, just to show in the assault, the Israeli assault of 2009, there was a demonstration every weekend, a national demonstration every weekend on the question of Palestine through the 4 weeks of the Israeli assault. So when in 2010, an Israeli institute called the Reut Institute was asked to summarize the Israeli lessons from the assault of 2009. They came up with the statement that Israel had won the ground war, which is a kind of odd thing to say since it was more like a massacre than a war, but they said we lost the propaganda war. And they said the propaganda war is being fought in, especially they said in London, in New York and Montreal. They know that they are liable to get the same thing, a continuous series of national demonstrations, this time because they got it last time. So I think there's a large element of bluff on Israel's part, because in 2009 they had to slip the whole assault in between the election of Obama and the inauguration of Obama, so they had that constraint. Now they claim they are unconstrained. They say there is no limit. But they are aware of 2009. So I think that's a very, that's a good context to look at the thing in, because if it happened before, if we made it happen before, we will make it happen again.
Mideast editor David Hurst argues in the Huffington Post the attack on Gaza comes by Saudi royal appointment, and he said the Mossad and Saudi intelligence officials meet regularly. Sabah Jawad, can you comment on that and tell us briefly what you think of the Saudi role in all this, be it before the attack or throughout it?
Well, the role of Bandar bin Sultan is a very obvious one. Everywhere he focuses on, you see that place is up in flames and destruction prevail.
Can you give us an example?
For example, Syria. And since he was responsible for what's the event and supporting terrorist groups initially and until he was ousted, it seems that when they failed to do their task designated to them by the American, they normally sacked, and this was happened to Bandar bin Sultan. And before him, the rulers of Qatar were also the Prime Minister and the Emir of Qatar was disbanded to London, and his the Emir's son was appointed as the ruler of
Sheikh Tamim, yes.
Sheikh Tamim was appointed the ruler of Qatar. So it seems that there is a link, a very strong link with the Saudi royal family, with all these takfiri forces and terrorist forces emerging very powerful in a very powerful way in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Iraq. We've seen how these terrorist groups initially was created by the CIA and the Saudi royal family in Afghanistan and the Arab fighters and so on, because they are politically and military trained by the Saudi and financed by the Saudi with the blessing of America to be used and utilized to fragment the Middle East and create chaos in the Middle East. So it's easy for the American to control that vital part of the Middle East as a resource for energy resource in the area as well, and to use the situation, their control of the Middle East, to fend off competition from new emerging powers in the world, like China, like Russia, like India, and so on in the future.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the IDF is progressing on the ground according to plan. The achievements on the battlefield are clear, and that he is impressed with the operations to destroy the tunnels, adding it was beyond expectation. Jim Brann, tell us, it's clear that the tunnels are a major element in Israel's security. Do you think now that this has been achieved, the crackdown on the tunnels, Israel will be more open to discuss a resolution and a ceasefire? Or do you think it has to wait until Hamas has no more influence in Palestine and no longer a part of the unity government until it can get into a conflict resolution?
I think that this line again of saying looking at reasons and looking at excuses is very important, because if you remember that originally the Israeli rationale was the rockets, even though somebody described the rockets, the Gazan rockets, as more like sophisticated fireworks, whereas we know that Israeli weaponry is extremely sophisticated. So even there's the two words are not describing the same thing. But then suddenly Netanyahu raised the question of the tunnels. And you have to ask yourself, we know that there have been tunnels, and I'm talking about between Gaza and Israel, although we know that Israel maintains this free fire zone between the borders of Gaza and Israel. And it has all the technology to detect tunnels. We know that there was this Israeli soldier, if you remember, Gilad Shalit, who was captured and held for 5 years and so on. And if there is this massive network of tunnels, either it's not being used because you can hardly name an incident as caused by Palestinians coming across the tunnels, or again you have to ask, is this just another excuse? And I suggest that it's just as liable to be a phantom, to be an excuse. It may help in the sense that if Netanyahu claims the tunnels were a problem, he can then declare that the tunnels are no longer a problem because it's entirely up to him. It's not subject to rational proof. But apart from that, I would say there's a couple of things worth pointing out. There is a large element of bluff in the Israeli position, because I do not think that they planned on, they thought that they would deal with the softening up of Gaza and then they would go in with the military. I do not think they expected 30 Israelis dead. It doesn't make sense. And an example of that is a man in United States, in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who says, incidentally, this Iron Dome system, you know, the Israelis claim to have this brilliant system for shooting down these rockets.
What did he say about that?
He said that it's bluff. And I just note, because the Israelis say...
That was from MIT.
This man from MIT, he produced a report that I think it came out yesterday because I read it today.
Yes.
He said that whereas the Israelis say that they shoot down 90%, that's what they claim, 90% of the projectiles coming from Gaza, he reckons they shoot down 5%. And he gives reasons. And I think so there's this large element of bluff, and you always have to look for the bluff, the element of excuse in what the Israelis say.
And now we are joined by Palestinian journalist Sameh Habib. Welcome on Straightforward.
Oh, thank you.
Sameh, what does it mean to you that Israel has its boots on the ground now?
Well, Israel is trying, I think, to achieve any victory. They've been there for nearly 18 days now, and they haven't achieved anything solid for them, really. And the Netanyahu government is trying to tell the National Front that, look, we are achieving success in the ground. We're attacking the tunnels that Hamas is using. We are ending the capacities of Hamas, although on the ground, the Israelis have not succeeded, really. What they've done so far is attacking some areas in the outer skirts of the Gaza city, and they have not really achieved anything in terms of the destroying the infrastructure of the Palestinian resistance, and I think it's going to be a very hard job to do. And I think because of the ceasefire talks taking place in Ramallah, Tel Aviv, and Cairo, so I think Israel is trying to put sort of pressure on the parties making these negotiations in order to achieve as much as possible. And Israel have been escalating their attacks since yesterday after the speech of Khalid Mish'al, where they knew that Hamas is not going to make any concessions, and the way to, in their view, to make Hamas making any concessions is just to put more pressure and to get more victims and casualties in the Palestinian side. So hopefully the people in Gaza, according to the Israelis, would rebel and do something against Hamas, which is not the case and would not happen.
Sameh, what do you think of the UN stance when it comes to assessing the violation of humanitarian law?
So you mean, I didn't get you, international law you asked me about?
The international humanitarian law, the UN did mention that there is a possibility that it could have been violated in Gaza, but they weren't really very blunt about it. They said it was just a possibility. What do you comment on that?
Okay, it's not possibility. You know, Israel has a black history of violating international law, committing war crimes, either starting in 1948 or in Lebanon later on or in other Arab countries. Israelis have been committing heinous massacres against the Arabs, and the international community has been cherishing and protecting Israel and Israeli leaders. And we cannot really forget what happened in Lebanon, Kana, when the Israelis have attacked the UN shelter twice in 1996, and I think
But let me stop you there, Sameh. Sameh, speaking of Kana and massacres, do you believe there's a threshold, basically, before the international community can take a very firm stance towards Israel?
Well, I think if we manage to get or mount more popular pressure, and we get more politicians and the media here to stand with us, and which is the case now, we're getting more people, more organizations joining us as Palestinians here, because what Israel is doing is something that those people cannot really stand. Even I know that Barry Gardner, who was member of parliament for Brann now, he was very supportive of Israel, but he was very critical, and he described the Israeli attacks on Gaza like a week ago as barbarism, you know, and this is the first time. So we got people changing their views because they cannot really agree on the grim Israeli attacks on the civilians in Gaza. So I don't know what is it that the international community is waiting. Are they waiting the Israelis to use their nuclear weapons in Iran or in Gaza, or what is it that they're waiting the Israelis? I think the international community is complicit. I think it's not only Israelis that are waging this war in Gaza. It's the international community. Europe, I think, gave the green light for the Israelis to make this full-scale attack. The Arab countries as well, they have given the Israelis the green light. And I think, I expect there will be more civilian casualties. As you know, today by itself, more 109 people killed in the heinous massacres across the Gaza Strip.
Yes, my last question, Sameh, and of course our guests will be joining, so stay with us when they do. Do you believe Hamas has the key to ceasefire? And do you think Israel will accept any mediation efforts to resolve the conflict, with Hamas still being part of the unity government in Palestine?
Well, Israelis have been manipulating, you know, when the national, you know, when if we track it back to when Hamas came to office in 2006 after the elections, they have refused Hamas to be part of the political game, okay? When this national unity government took place 2 months ago, okay, Hamas was not in there really. Even if we talk about a national agreement between Fatah and Hamas, yes, there was a national agreement, but there were none of like the persons appointed by Hamas or some people who affiliated Hamas within the government. Yes. So practically Hamas left the office 2 months ago. But I think Israel has wanted any kind of war to cover the failure of the peace process with the Palestinian Authority. Simply, it's not about the national unity. It's a pretext that Israel is using in the international community to say to those people, look, guys, Hamas is a terrorist organization. It can be part of this political game, and we have to attack them. This is what the Israelis want, simply to cover the failure with the peace process that took place with Abbas. They've been negotiating for a long time, and the Americans were blaming the Israelis for not giving up on the settlements, confiscating lands in the West Bank, and they have blamed them publicly, really. So Israel had to go to war, and I think the reason for going to this war, as I said, is to cover the failure.
Do you agree, Sabah?
Yeah.
Stay with us, Sam.
Absolutely, I agree with that, and I think the Israelis are really conscientious about what's been happening in Gaza, because we've seen what's happening in Shuja'iyya in the area, and in the past couple of days also there is a wholesale slaughter of Palestinian civilians in other part of Gaza as well. Israel tried to prevent journalists, Western journalists, from entering into such areas to discover what's been happening, and according to some reports, the bodies are in the street of Gaza in some areas, and the atrocities that took place in Shuja'iyya, for example, has been well documented as well. I think these reports will eventually see the light, and people will be aware of the atrocities that taken place in Palestine, because Israel is failing actually to achieve its military and political objective in Gaza. They're resorting to mass killing of Palestinian innocent civilians and also children. They wanted to cow the Palestinian people by killing their children and committing such vile atrocities. The international humanitarian organization will be able to condemn it, but will not be able to do much unless there is a mass dissent in the West by the people on the street demanding justice for the Palestinian people. We cannot go on for another 10 years and 15 years to see continuously such massacres committed against the Palestinian people, and we have 100,000 or 50,000 demonstrations on the street. We need a massive campaign actually to boycott Israel and to say to Israel, in the 21st century there is no time and place for a state, racist state like you, to exist.
Jim Brann, what is in your opinion the way out of the conflict at the diplomatic level at least, or political level?
Well, the danger with that is it presents too much trust in the players. I mean, it's notable, for example, that Hammond, the new British Foreign Secretary, was sat next to Netanyahu today, and in his interview immediately, he was expressing support for Israel and saying that, Israel was justified in self-defense and so on. But when he came out and spoke to Sky News television in Britain, he said that there was, a real danger that Israel would overstep the mark and the casualties were becoming too great and so on. And in that, I think he's genuinely reflecting a fear, not that he's personally concerned, but simply because they do realize that more than any other issue in the world, really, in general, the issue of occupation belongs first of all in the hands of the people who are faced with occupation. But in the case of Palestine, it's that bit different, because it's clearly an international issue, and the Israelis, the report I was quoting earlier into the 2009 assault, made it very clear that Israel sees the danger of losing the propaganda war as being a very important element, and therefore it puts places like London and world opinion far more at center stage.
Sameh Habib, do you think there will be any avenues to conflict resolution in the near future?
Well, for the time being, I think it's going to take quite a while, really. The Americans came to the region. Kerry made some sort of advancement within the ceasefire talks, but I think it needs some more time. The Israelis need to, I think, if the Israelis would need to agree on a ceasefire, there got to be more pressure from the Palestinian resistance, and that's the case now. Ben Gurion Airport is on hold again today, as more airline companies have suspended their flights to Israel. The rockets have reached the airport again today. There's more Israeli casualties, but as you know, Israelis would not really recognize the real number, but there's at least 8 killed today. So the more we have a pressure within the front on the on the national front within Israel, I think we would see a quick end to what is happening. On the Palestinian side, if you hear what's going on, the people there, they don't care now. They say it's either we get the siege lifted and our suffering come to an end, or we die, because we already die in a slow manner. The siege that is being imposed in Gaza for a very long time is sort of a slow death that is sentencing people to sort of suffering and despair. So people now in Gaza, they have no choice. The choice that they have in front of them is just ending the siege of Gaza, and this is the reason that Hamas demands are still solid and they didn't make any concessions. And I don't think that Hamas would make sort of essential conditions. Hamas might make some sort of concessions on its demands, but not the main ones. Really. It could be about the technicalities of when and how and where to achieve these conditions, but I think Hamas is not going to make lots of concessions on this regard.
Palestinian journalist Sameh Habib joined us from London. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks a lot.
I would like to thank our guests with me at the studio, Jim Brann of Stop the War Coalition and Sabah Jawad of Iraqis Against Occupation. And our other guests joined us over the phone, Tamara Barakat and Muhammad Ali, and Palestinian journalist Sameh Habib. Although Operation Protective Edge may in fact compel Hamas to enter more serious negotiations, analysts argue the group might see ground incursions as an opportunity to entangle the IDF in prolonged, indecisive fighting, which means a conflict in which Israeli military and Palestinian civilian casualties increase. Such a scenario could set the stage for a critical Israeli decision on whether to expand the operation. And while many believe that Israel will end its operation when its objectives are achieved, others argue that, as it has been from the beginning, the end to this latest round of fighting and the welfare of the people of Gaza is in the hands of Hamas. I'll be with you again soon on Straightforward.